Most operators assume the instability they feel comes from imperfect systems. The calendar is not structured enough. The documentation is not clean enough. The workflow is not tight enough. So they optimize. They adjust planning cadences, rebuild templates, redesign handoffs, and reorganize priorities. On the surface, that looks disciplined. In practice, it often hides the structural problem. The problem is not a lack of optimization, it is a lack of completion. When work does not reach a defined end state, it does not exit your nervous system. It stays open. A strategy that is partially debated, a proposal that is mostly written, a decision that was informally agreed on but never documented, a roadmap that keeps extending because phases never formally end. Each of these is an unfinished loop. And unfinished loops create cognitive residue. Cognitive residue is the background tension that comes from knowing something is still active, even when you are not actively working on it. The brain tracks open commitments whether or not they are in focus. That tracking consumes invisible bandwidth. This is why a fully demanding project that closes can feel cleaner than a lighter workload that never finishes. The visible workload might look manageable, but fatigue rises because the invisible queue is expanding. A simple analogy is browser tabs. You might be using only one tab, but if there are dozens of tabs open, the system slows. Unfinished work functions the same way. The mind keeps it loaded. Once you see that, daily behavior becomes easier to explain. Meetings multiply because nothing fully resolved in the previous meeting. People leave with alignment that was never turned into a documented decision, so the same topic returns in a different room with different context. Follow-ups appear because there was no exit condition. Documents expand because clarity was never forced through finalization. Instead of distillation, there is accumulation. Instead of a final version that holds a decision, there is a living draft that keeps growing. Verbosity often signals incomplete thinking. When an idea has not been finalized internally, it expands externally. Roadmaps stretch because phases never ended formally. Work keeps moving forward, but nothing truly closes. The project becomes a long chain of partial states. Feedback cycles stall because outputs were incomplete. People cannot evaluate what they cannot see as finished. Learning blurs because there is no clean endpoint to measure against. Reflection requires finished cycles. Strategy depends on signal, and signal requires closure. This is where a common misframing appears. Optimization becomes a socially acceptable substitute for finishing. Refinement feels productive. Tuning feels intelligent. Debate feels thoughtful. But none of these reduce cognitive residue if the underlying work remains open. Optimization as avoidance is not usually conscious. It is often a protection mechanism. Completion forces exposure. It forces trade-offs. It creates finality. It invites judgment. Refinement can feel safer because it allows movement without closure. You can keep working without committing. Over time, weak admission standards create drift. If work enters the system without a clear definition of done, it has no natural exit. Meetings without resolution criteria lead to follow-up meetings. Projects without defined endpoints extend indefinitely. Documents without decision thresholds become permanent drafts. Then drift becomes normalized. People start treating partial states as the standard. The organization becomes accustomed to almost as a steady state. That is when complexity accumulates. And complexity layered on top of unfinished behavior increases instability rather than reducing it. This is also where burnout gets misdiagnosed. Burnout, in this frame, is not purely about hours worked. It is about sustained exposure to unresolved loops. The nervous system does not distinguish between a task that is actively being worked on and one that remains incomplete but unclosed. Both consume bandwidth. This changes the central decision. The decision is simple but uncomfortable. Finish before you refine. Completion is not a stylistic preference. It is an admission standard. Work should not qualify for optimization until it has reached a defined, observable end state at least once. If you try to improve something that is never closed, you create variability without baseline proof. Adjustments multiply without signal. Complexity rises without stability. Clarity reduces pressure because it narrows focus. When finishing becomes the constraint, fewer items are allowed into motion at the same time. Open loops shrink. Decisions become lighter because they are not stacked on unresolved predecessors. Energy consolidates. By contrast, when refinement is the default impulse, attention disperses. Every element appears improvable. Every document feels adjustable. Every process seems debatable. Pressure increases because nothing stabilizes. Finishing creates proof. Proof generates signal. Signal enables intelligent refinement. This is also the proper role of systems. Systems exist to reduce cognitive load, not increase activity. At their core, systems are mechanisms for closure. They define entry criteria, progression standards, and exit conditions. A mature system does not add effort. It removes ambiguity. It prevents unresolved loops from recycling indefinitely. It creates structural bias toward done. When systems are layered onto unfinished behavior, they amplify instability. You get more structure without more closure. The purpose of structure is not sophistication. It is stability. Stability emerges when loops close predictably. Once predictable closure exists, refinement becomes meaningful. So if you feel scattered, do not start by optimizing. Start by closing. Pick one open loop and define what done looks like in observable terms. Close it. Document the decision. Publish the output. End the phase. Create an exit condition. Then, and only then, refine the process you used. Finish before you refine. Completion creates signal. Proof before refinement. That is how bandwidth returns.